Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm enjoying the intensity that the sun is getting. It is getting higher on the horizon, and I've been enjoying wandering around the yard, just soaking up a little bit of sunshine.
Longer days and, boy, sunnier days, right? It is really, really nice, and it just seems like, I know that we seem to be having an early spring a couple weeks ago where we were at the temperatures where we were at now, but then we had a snow come through. Now all that snow is melting again.
Yeah, the sun zapped that right out of you, the snow.
And so it's really nice. And so here we are, we're towards, the last third of March, and we really are feeling spring.
We are, and I can tell by my email inbox that people are getting anxious for spring, because I've gotten a number of emails, people asking about how to prevent or deal with weeds in their vegetable garden. So it's going to be fun today's podcast to talk about controlling weeds in the vegetable garden, because that's something we all deal with.
And this is a great time of the year to kind of come up with a game plan before
those little weeds
outside.
Will be sprouting.
Exactly. It's something
it.
You want to get on top of early. But before we get into that, you've got a email from a listener.
Yes, Mary wrote in. And Mary says, we recently moved into a home along the river. Now that most of the snow has melted, we've been outside making plans for landscaping improvements. We were surprised and somewhat disappointed to discover the lawn is extremely uneven with hard, bumpy clumps. Aeration may make a difference, but that's questionable considering how bumpy the lawn is. Do you know what contributes to this condition? And do you have any other ideas on how to treat the lawn? Thanks in advance, from Mary. Well, thanks, Mary, for writing in. As soon as you mentioned bumpiness on the lawn, I thought night crawlers. Whenever you notice bumpiness on a lawn, that it's physically difficult to walk across that lawn because you're feeling all this bumpiness, it's almost always night crawler activity. In fact, I liken it to walking across golf balls.
Ooh.
I've had some people even mention that they feel like they're going to turn an ankle.
Not good.
Okay, well, night crawlers do good things to our soil. As they're working along through the turf profile and just kind of under the surface, they're kind of channeling through all the dirt and the old grass clippings and all that stuff. They're turning it into wonderful compost, so they do good things to the soil. But as they're working along, they make all these little mounds. Now, the mounds are usually invisible. You can't see them above ground necessarily because they're kind of hidden in the profile. But boy, can you tell it when you walk across those little mounds. Now, to how to deal with this, because it is difficult walking across them, even though they're doing good stuff. So there are no chemical products that are labeled for nightcrawler control, since they are actually a protected type species. So things that we need to do to kind of limit the difficulty, there are some cultural type things we can do. For example, when we water our lawn, we should water less frequently, but deeper. If we water deeply, that'll encourage the night crawlers to go deeper down into the soil, and they won't cause all the little annoying bumps or big annoying bumps on the lawn surface. That helps. And also, to make the lawn more walkable this spring, core aeration or power raking, also known as dethatching, that will tend to level out the bumps that you feel. And so we're kind of somewhat limited to the cultural type things. But if we kind of work with those, it'll make the bumpiness a lot less apparent. Have you ever walked across the lawn, John, where there have been night crawlers?
I don't think so. I don't believe I have.
Our old lawn before we moved to our newer location about 10 years ago, we had night crawlers. And that's how, it's the type of thing when you've walked across it, you know it.
Okay.
Because it is just like, wow, I am walking on a lot of bumps.
When she said that she was down by the river, I was wondering, would a clay soil, would that be a factor in that at all?
I think you're right. Because if these night crawlers work in a sandy soil, I think as you would walk across them, I think the sand would just kind of compress. But anybody that's ever worked in our heavy clay soils, when they form a little hard ball, that little hard ball stays in a hard ball.
Right.
And so along the river probably tends to be clay or clay deposits. I think those night crawlers are probably making little clay balls. Eventually that'll kind of break down, but in the meantime, I think that's what you're probably feeling is a lot of little clay golf balls.
Oh, doesn't sound like a pleasant experience.
No, exactly.
I can see why you'd want to head that off at the pass.
So thank you, Mary, for writing in, and anyone else who has questions, comments. Maybe if you found a way to deal with night crawlers in your lawn, let me know. Send me an email, donald.kinsler, KINZLER, @ndsu.edu.
Well, good stuff. Well, not necessarily you did say that you've been getting a lot of emails about this, so not necessarily a letter, but let's get into the topic today. Let's get into talking about...
I think we're all anxious to get the vegetable garden planted. We're a ways away from the actual planting, but I'm happy to hear that people are kind of thinking about how are we going to control the weeds this year? So it's a fun topic to address.
Yeah, so how do you start with that, and when should we start?
Well, and of course, the difficulty with weeds in a vegetable garden is that they just rob things. They rob the moisture away from our vegetable plants. They can even overshadow. Weeds grow so quick. I guess that's what makes them a good weed, right. Is they're deep-rooted in most cases. That's why they take the moisture. They can overshadow your good vegetable plants, so they're limiting the sunshine. They take away the nutrients, and they can outcompete things so much that the vegetables can just diminish, kind of slink away, and what you're left is a whole bunch of weeds. There's nothing more discouraging than a vegetable garden in which the weeds have gotten away from you. It is just, I've seen some vegetable gardeners who have just mowed over the whole thing with their lawnmower in mid-season because it just got away from them. So the trick really is, what we're going to talk about, is getting on top of it, planning, getting on top of it early so that none of this happens. It is actually thrilling to watch your vegetable garden grow and develop and know that you're on top of the weeds. And so now, whether it's a raised garden or an in-ground garden, I think all of us deal with weeds. Mm-hmm. I've enjoyed gardening since I was 5 years old. There's not been a year that I haven't dealt with weeds. So it's not like, well, someday you have it such that no weeds are going to come. But the encouraging thing is, each year, if you stay on top of it, the weeds become less and less and less. So you can really get it to a manageable level. And so anyway, now, John, I know you do kind of raised gardening.
Mm-hmm. For our vegetables, yeah.
Yeah. One advantage of that is you can kind of use a designer-type soil that's probably less apt to have weeds in it. But I'm guessing you probably still have some weeds that you need.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they happen. Yeah, and you get all the...
They float in, they drop in.
All the
birds
seedlings,
bring a few.
yes, exactly.
The trees drop little seedlings all over. And so even raised gardens, and of course we have an in-ground garden, and of course we got lots of weeds there. So the key is to kind of develop a season-long strategy for it. Now, one thing that's really important when we talk about weed control in the vegetable garden is we need to distinguish between annual weeds and perennial weeds. Of course, annual weeds are weeds that just germinate from seed in the soil, and they just grow for that season. Then when frost comes, they die. Perennial weeds, on the other hand, grow from a winter-hardy root system that stays there. Dandelions. If you don't do anything with a dandelion, that dandelion keeps coming back for the next 30, 40 years or more.
Thistles can be like that too, right? Yeah.
And all of these tend to spread quite readily. They'll drop seed, and so they can sprout from seed, but they have underground root systems, so thistles will spread far and wide. Let's see, what are some other common perennial weeds that a person might find in your garden? Thistles, quackgrass, definitely. Yeah. That'll pop up. So between dandelions, thistle, quackgrass, and a few others, those are probably the main garden ones. But, hoeing them out at the surface doesn't do it because they've got an established root system, so they just keep popping up. So annual weeds, the little ones that sprout from a seedling, from a seed, are much easier to deal with. The perennial type weeds require heavy digging, deep digging, or maybe we'll opt to use some herbicide carefully placed on those. So it's kind of important to know what type of weed you're dealing with.
Is there an easy way to tell, or is it just a matter of the more you do it, the more you know? Or do you have like
recognizing the type, but also annual weeds, since they begin each spring sprouting from a little seed, they are much easier to pull and to get the root system out. So young annual weed that's coming out, one way is just to pull or dig down just a little with your fingers and it pops out easily. It's probably an annual weed. Whereas if it's got a root system, again talking like April, early May, if it's got a big root system that you're trying to pull out and it's attached by a big root, that's almost always a perennial type weed. Right. The other thing that's interesting is, in one of the emails I got, address this. A couple of years ago, they had worked up a new garden area in their yard. And the first couple of years, they said they're just overwhelmed with weeds. So they had kind of killed off the grass in an area, or removed or smothered the grass, and then tilled it up, and bingo, it was just covered with weeds during that gardening season. Most of our soils have what's termed a weed bank, from years or decades of maybe weed seed, either being blown in, dropped by birds. Maybe it was a farm field before that lawn was ever put in, and they had weeds. And so, in most cases, there's a weed bank of seed in all of our soils. And as soon as you till it up and prepare a garden, there comes all the weeds. Did that in ours, where we currently have our vegetable garden, was a pasture. And as soon as I tilled that up, bingo, there were all the weed seeds. They get brought up to the surface, exposed to light, moisture, and there they are. So a lot of our soil, wouldn't it be nice if you'd work up a soil and then just plant your stuff and all that would grow would be your good stuff?
Right.
But no, we've unleashed the weeds and the weed seeds. But we can deal with them. So it's quite important to realize that our soils do have that bank of weed seeds. Maybe it's perennial weed roots that are down there, quackgrass, etc. So important to realize that you're unleashing that when you first start.
All right. Well, let's take a quick break, and then let's get talking more about how to go about preventing weeds.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back, and this week we're talking about weed control, how to get out in front of it before the growing season, especially in your vegetable garden.
Yes, and so we've got people thinking already about how to deal with this, and it's always in my mind too, because it's not going to be too long in our vegetable gardens when we get some sunshine and warmth that we're going to see little seedlings start popping up, or maybe it's perennials growing back from some of the root. So it's important to start early in the season. Now, my in-ground vegetable garden, I rototill up each spring. So in the spring, I'm going to till. The shallower or more lightly you can till, the better.
Okay.
Because that brings less weed seed up. Generally, the deeper you till, you're bringing up more and more weed seed up to the surface. And if the weed seeds are down deep enough, they'll just kind of stay there. well, they're probably going to remain viable for many years. But if you don't bring them up to the surface where they get exposed to enough light and stuff, they'll just kind of stay down there.
They won't flourish. They won't,
Exactly. So there's a case to be made for, if you do rototill, to not go so deep and to keep the weed seeds kind of down, way down below. And now, if you're in a raised garden, each year, if you kind of fluff up the soil, work up that soil a little bit, in a raised garden, you're probably going to have less of a weed bank than you may be in an in-ground garden. So in my own garden, then when the soil's kind of dried enough to where I can rototill, then I do rototill. And sometimes... I suppose we're talking what, April? At some point in April, I'm rototilling. But with the sunshine and moisture from the melted snow, there will oftentimes be some weeds already starting to grow. I can see little weed seedlings grow. So I kind of time my first rototilling after those little tiny weeds are just starting to grow, because then my shallow rototilling kills them off. So I'm kind of I'm killing a crop of weeds, and also any dandelions or thistles that I see growing. I could try to dig deeply. Now, thistle roots can go 8 feet deep. So trying to dig out totally a thistle root is almost out of the question. But if I can dig deep enough, I'm going to slow it down. Mm-hmm. And if on some of those perennial weeds, if you opt to just dig them, if as soon as they pop up again, if you dig them down, eventually you can conquer them even from digging. But if you let it regrow and kind of start flourishing with a bunch of leaves, you've gone downhill again. It just reestablishes. Or maybe in the spring of the year when those perennial weeds start growing, maybe we would opt to use a little bit of herbicide, like glyphosate, just carefully targeted on the thistle. Glyphosate doesn't have soil carryover, so you can vegetable garden soon after that again. So maybe you'd put just a little bit of spot of glyphosate on the thistle, or a little bit of 2,4-D on a dandelion, and maybe you opt to do it that way. There's a couple other that kind of neat ways that you see mentioned. One of those is solarization. Solarization is meant to kill off the weed seeds in a garden bed. And in solarization, you lay clear plastic over the soil surface, and the sunlight coming through penetrates down through the clear plastic and bakes the seed. The idea is to raise the temperature high enough that it's going to kill the weed bank of seeds in the soil.
So it's like a greenhouse without venting.
Exactly. And so it, from heat, is meant to sterilize those weed seeds out of that. Now, okay, to get a high enough temperature to kill those, it's going to mean the outdoor temperature and everything is going to have to be fairly high. So in most cases, solarization is going to have to be done during the growing season before you want to garden. Putting down clear plastic in April and the first part of May is probably not going to kill enough weed seeds to let you still garden from middle of May on. Okay, because, it just hasn't gotten hot enough and long enough yet. But, if somebody's preparing an area a year in advance, maybe you'd choose to solarize that. The other is, and I love the term, occultation, from the occult, I suppose.
Okay.
And that is putting something dark, black, a tarp, over the soil surface and smothering. Especially useful for perennial weeds that are coming up. So perennial weeds that'll start popping up already in April, such as the thistles, dandelions, quackgrass, you could use the occult method and cover them with a tarp, cardboard, what am I trying to say?
Staggered so that they're...
overlapped.
Overlapped, yep.
Yeah, so that it's totally dark underneath. And so that type of smothering can be very effective. But now those perennial weeds, and it'll take care of any annual weeds that are starting to germinate too. But those perennial weeds like thistles are so tenacious that it's probably going to take smothering for the better half of the growing season. So smothering in April and early May, when you take off that covering, everything may probably appear that it's gone, but thistles have enough of a root, they're going to come back. But if you were to smother that for the entire growing season, such again, maybe planning a year ahead for a vegetable garden, then that can work too. Chances of getting solarization or occultation to work the same season you want to garden probably wouldn't happen. But, you could certainly try it if you want. But both are kind of things that you see when you're looking, on some of the national gardening sites and things. Sometimes you'll see that, the solarization or smothering. So a couple of things, if we get right into the planting. Okay, so we've got our raised bed prepared, or I've got my garden tilled up a little bit. I'm ready to plant. In my garden, I enjoy putting markers at both ends of the row in which I've seeded vegetables. So I seed my carrots, and then I put a little wooden stake down at each end, and I do that for every row of things that I plant. So then I know when I'm all done, I know exactly where the rows of vegetables are.
Okay.
And I usually put the little seed packet down by it so I know to expect carrots where I planted the carrots. Now, when you plant tomato plants and pepper plants, you can see those immediately.
Right.
The starter plants. Okay. My objective for putting a stake at each end of the row is weeds usually pop up much quicker than the vegetables do. I guess that's what makes them good weeds. Right. And by knowing exactly where my row is, being able to eye down between those two stakes, I can weed with a hoe in between the rows. I give myself a little leeway so I'm not hoeing into where the carrots are going to be popping up. Mm-hmm. But I can do a pretty good swath in between. And then, instead of having a big carpet of weeds coming up, I've got at least some areas that are clean of weeds. Then, when the little weeds are coming right in the row, as soon as my carrots or radishes appear, then I go along on hands and knees and I hand weed within the row. And so knowing where you've planted the material really helps. And that could be done, too, in a raised planter if you just kind of know where it is that you did plant those, so you can be watching for those in that area. And if there's some blank spaces in between, then you could go ahead and weed those just as the weeds are coming up. So are you able to do that in your raised planter? Are you able to kind of see, for example, the carrots and things?
We could do that, yeah. We haven't done it in rows like that and haven't labeled them. A lot of the times we did do radishes, we did do carrots from seed. Like you said, tomato plants we do as plants.
Sure.
We buy the plants. But yeah, so that's it's kind of a good way to do that, to mark them that way so you know where the parameters are.
And of course, where the tomato transplants are and the pepper plants and the cabbage plants, weeding is a lot easier early because you know where that plant is. I learned a new word. I love it. Count the day lost, you don't learn something new. I learned a new term, white thread stage. The white thread stage of weeds. I had never heard that term. And where I saw this was I was doing a little bit of checking on if there was anything new in weed control. And there was a site that recommended that the best time to kill annual-type weeds, those that are sprouting from their little seeds, was when you can barely see them at the white thread stage. And what that stage is, it's when the little weed seeds are just starting to sprout, maybe barely breaking the soil surface, and when you go along with a hoe and shallowly cultivate, what it brings up is all the little white thread-like roots and emerging stems. And of course, I've seen that when I hoe. I just never heard it called the white thread stage. I love it when early in the season, okay, when you've transplanted your tomatoes and pepper plants, and I've done my rows of the vegetables, And when you can start seeing the little weed seeds just coming through, and then when you take your sharp hoe and cultivate shallowly, and you can see the little white germinating weed seeds, and then they're so easily killed at that stage. A little bit of exposure to the sun and air, and they're just fried. And it's such a sense of accomplishment to get the weeds when they're young like that. Maybe I'm using my long-handled hoe, or maybe I'm with my handheld hoe getting close to vegetables. But it's such a sense of accomplishment getting the weeds, getting hundreds or thousands of little weeds nipped at that stage, because I know what they can grow into. They're the type of weed, those weeds, if allowed to grow, that's what turns your garden into a carpet of weeds that eventually will get ahead of everything. And like I say, some people, if they lose the battle, they'll just mow off the whole garden, which is so tragic. But, one thing, weeds don't tend to get any smaller.
No.
When there are these little germinating weeds, they're the type that can get 2 to 3 feet tall if you just let them go. And so I just am thrilled when I get them. Now I know what that term is, the white thread stage, when those little weeds are just barely working. And so a quick pass with a hoe just gets them like that. So anyway, we talked about me in between rows. If your things are planted in rows, you can quite early on, even before the vegetables are visible, get in between rows with your hoe or a little cultivator of some sort. And then around the transplants, you can hoe around those just as the weeds are coming up. We've talked about garden tools. The thin type hoe that will just kind of scour through the surface inch or so and get all those.
Something with a good sharp blade.
Good sharp blade that'll just kind of pass right on through. And, excuse me, and it doesn't have to take that long, really. When weeds get 1, 2, 3 inches tall, and you're trying to hoe out that is a lot of work. But just a few minutes every other day can really go through a vegetable garden quite efficiently and quite quickly. And but boy, once you're trying to hoe out these established weeds and a couple inches tall is all it takes for them to become really annoying. And sometimes we mentioned digging out some of the perennial weeds. I use my hori-hori knife, which is a serrated Japanese knife. I think the length of the blade, it's probably maybe not a foot, but 10 inches. And so that can go down and dig out the thistle. So I'm always on my watch for thistles popping up. And whenever they do, I dig them out as deep as I can. And as you're scouting your garden, if one happens to pop back up again, we'll nip it out before it can reestablish itself. And eventually you do win the battle. Another thing that many of us use is mulch in the garden, which is really effective used early on. So when the vegetable garden is clean, still quite clean, you can see where your vegetables are, where they're emerging, or maybe you've cleaned it up good from that first batch of weeds that's popping up, and then mulch. Straw, grass clippings that haven't been treated with herbicide, cardboard, fastened down, that can work as a good mulch. Some people use newspaper, shredded newspaper or other paper can kind of mesh, and once it's wet down, it kind of makes a nice mulch too. I've seen people use shredded up newspaper quite effectively as a mulch. And so that put on clean soil. Mulch has to be thick enough, otherwise the weeds will just kind of appear right on through that as well. And especially around like tomatoes and peppers and plants that you're putting out from a transplant. One thing that's fascinating, though, on mulching heat-loving plants, I think I've mentioned in past podcasts that my mom, we always would mulch our tomato plants. Okay, because that keeps them clean, cuts down blossom end rot, etc. Okay, so
keeps the moisture in too.
Keeps the moisture in, exactly. And so I oftentimes would ask my mom when we were setting out tomato plants in May, how come we aren't going to put the straw mulch around them now? It'd be a lot easier to mulch those tomato plants when they're small. And Mom said, well, because she had learned, she was a good gardener, had learned through experience, she said, if we put that straw on now in May, the soil's still relatively cool. When the soil warms up, when it goes through all of May and a good chunk of June, that soil is going to be a lot warmer. Then that is the time to put on the mulch before they start setting fruit. So then you get less blossom end rot, etc. So the point being, a person should, for tomatoes and peppers and other heat-loving things, should let the soil warm up first before you put the mulch on. And then, of course, a mulch of straw or other things put on at a certain point, mid to late June, that's going to help with the weed control later on. So you might end up doing a little hoeing or other weed control before you do that. But that is one caution on putting mulch on too early right around tomato or pepper plants. But boy, mulch can just be a lifesaver down in between rows of vegetables, in the walkways and things. That can cut down on a lot of weeding. Now, how in your raised bed garden, do you depend mostly on hand weeding, or have you used any mulch in your raised bed?
Especially around the tomatoes, we've used mulch, and I think that was something that you recommended, and we've had a lot of success with that. That's been really nice. Again, for both for suppressing weeds, but then also for just maintaining moisture in that area. So it's been really nice. And honestly, we use a black mulch, and I think it kind of adds a little cleaner look to it, too.
It does. So. And there's an important rule of nature, never to leave soil uncovered. In nature, it's usually covered, with prairie grass, wildflowers. About the only spot you see soil uncovered or open is probably in a desert. Otherwise, it's just more natural to have a cover on soil. And so, your idea of mulching that, it gives a good look, retains moisture, cuts down weeds.
All right, let's take another quick break, and we come back more with combating weeds in your vegetable garden.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, we're back, and this week we're talking about getting a handle and developing a game plan for dealing with weeds in your vegetable garden. And we were talking about doing things like hoeing and weeding by hand and putting mulch down. But is there anything that we can do, like any chemicals that we can do that we could put in our vegetable garden that would kind of keep weeds away or keep them from developing?
Wouldn't it be great if there was a product that you could just somehow put on the vegetable garden and all the vegetables would grow and none of the weeds? Well, that
was chemically safe.
Yes, that was chemically safe. Yeah, exactly. And so the question oftentimes comes up, what about Preen, Preen, which is sold at most garden centers, national chains. It's in the big yellow package with red printing.
People who swear by it in their flower garden.
Exactly. I've used it in our flower garden. Preen is a pre-emergent herbicide, weed killer, and pre-emergent meaning that you apply the granules. It takes some moisture to activate, so either water it in or with rain, and it creates a chemical barrier on the soil so that when the weed seeds sprout, it kills them. And so around, when one looks at the label, there are certain vegetables that are cleared for use of preen or other pre-emergents. And so, for example, on tomatoes, but again, always follow that label. For example, around tomatoes, where you plant your transplant, you can sprinkle the preen granules around that, and it forms that surface barrier which would kill the weed seeds. There are certain other vegetables that it can be used on, but again, consult the label for the latest on that. But now the interesting thing is, okay, if it kills weed seeds as it germinates, Some vegetable seeds would also be killed as they sprout. So the label has to be followed very, very carefully. And yeah, I use it routinely on our flower gardens. And so there are certain vegetables that people might choose to use it on too. And so that's one option. Other herbicides, I mentioned carefully targeting some of the perennial weeds with something such as glyphosate or 2,4-D, carefully put on some of the weeds. And many people opt not to use any of the chemical, and there are great ways to win the battle without using any of those. But again, those are things that some people do opt to use. Now, one interesting thing is we can help to control some weeds just by the way we water.
Really?
Yes. The soaker hoses, the hoses that you stretch out along a row of vegetables, they'll slowly soak down right at the base of those vegetables, such as I use around our tomatoes a lot.
Okay.
And so the water will go right down into the root system, and you get less water in the pathways and areas where an overhead sprinkler would water the whole area. And if the areas that you don't need water stay dry, then the weed seed will tend to not germinate, because the weed seed needs moisture. And so the more areas that you water, the more weed seeds you're probably going to get sprouted. So trying to keep the watering only where you want it, right at the base of plants, can help cut down the weeding also. So overhead sprinkling, sometimes that's the only option, but overhead watering will wet all the pathways and everything, and so it tends to get a little more weed seed sprouting in those areas as well.
And plus, for things like we've talked about too with tomatoes, doing kind of maybe a big showering, watering can really splash up and could lead to blossom.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, exactly. Yep, the overhead sprinkling contributes to more disease spreading of bacteria and fungi as the water splashes the soil particles around. Also, the encouraging thing by about mid-season is if you've manage the weed control up until about mid-season, it oftentimes becomes less of a chore, because as the vegetables spread out and shade the ground, they tend to get the upper hand and outcompete the weeds. For example, as the string beans get more bushier and the tomatoes get more widespread, and they shield the sun from the ground. They shade the ground, and so there's less ability of weed seeds to sprout as the season goes on. So the more foliage cover you can get, the better. So, and of course, too, our midsummer tends to probably get a little drier, and if we're watering kind of only at the base of plants, also, at that point we can start getting ahead of the battle a little bit. So it's kind of encouraging at that point. And when you think of cucumbers or pumpkins or squash, they do a pretty good job of covering that soil. And it's kind of fun to see your vegetables get the upper hand in the battle. And of course, so we've kind of helped them along up to that point by us doing our jobs. And then, so yeah, shading. And as we get kind of towards the end of the season, I'm sure I'm not the only gardener that can fall into this trap. Okay, you've weeded the first half of the season. You keep watch during mid-season, but as the things start to grow and spread out, you maybe have to do a little less weeding. But boy, it's so easy towards the end of the season when you see a red root pigweed popping up here and there. It's tempting just to let it be, but those annual weeds are spreading probably thousands and thousands of seed again. So for every weed that you can prevent from going to seed, the ones that have escaped your efforts so far, if you can prevent them from going to seed, you're preventing them from redepositing seeds back down into the seed bank that we talked about earlier. So every one that you can just get rid of, even towards the end of the season, not to let up your, not to let your guard down at all, but to just keep on them. And then it does, the chore does become less. I can tell. Our garden now will be going probably into its about 10th year. Each year, the weeding is getting a little less. I can tell the weed bank is starting to run out a little bit. But I got to tell you something. Okay, I talked about not letting a weed escape. Well, I let a very large red root pigweed, and they just seed tremendously. Okay, I let one of them go because it was kind of intertwined in my fence a little bit, and it was kind of hard to pull because it was all rooted, and I didn't get it in time, and it sent seeds. The following year then, I could see where that weed had been because there were I'm sure at least 1,000 or more little seedlings coming up all around that area where I know that weed had been, and I know I didn't get it in time. And the other cases like purslane. Are you familiar with
Yes, I know purslane.
Purslane, that little
consistent battle.
low-growing, consistent battle. And I know you can eat it. It's delicious with ranch dressing and all that, And if you want to dedicate a part of your garden to it, but it just spreads and spreads. And I can tell in my garden, and if there are some areas along the perimeter where I didn't get that in time, and it sends more seeds, and then the following year you are really battling a lot of purslane.
And purslane can be relatively easy to pull up.
Yes.
And so if you want to feel good that you're making progress,
yes.
pick on your purslane, and
even once it gets bigger,
it's
if the ground is moist enough, you can grab it and pull it out. When it's very tiny, it hoes easily. Yeah. I get a kick out of purslane because if you pull out one of these big, they almost look like a doily. Remember the doilies that your moms used to use on all the end tables? They look like these flat doilies. And what I get a kick out of is when you pull those out, I've even tried turning them upside down to try to kill them. But they have a way of re-rooting, turning themselves back upright. And so they almost have to be physically removed from the garden. Otherwise, they find a way to keep growing. And so you got to admire their abilities.
Admire maybe, but not. We don't want to celebrate it.
No, exactly. And so anyway, with all those things considered, it is so enjoyable to win that battle. Maybe not 100%, but if we can get 90% and have our garden productive, where the weeds did not take over, and then we're making headway. Vegetable gardening is so rewarding. And again, like I mentioned earlier, there's nothing more disheartening than if the weeds get ahead. And so that's why I smile when I'm getting them all, the weeds, early in the season when it's when they're little and easy, and the task almost, I've likened it to eating popcorn. When you're going through weeding, it can really become addictive because you know the benefit that you're doing early on.
All right. Well, this has been good, but if people have any questions about weeding in their vegetable garden or in their yard, or any other questions about gardening, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, and if you have a favorite way of tackling and overcoming these weeds, we'd love to hear about it. Send us an email, donald.kinsler, KINZLER, @ndsu.edu. And thanks for everyone who does send in those emails.
Yeah, I'd love to hear if anybody has had success with solarization or occultation.
Yes, we've learned several new terms.
Yes, this is very good. All right, Don, well, thanks a lot for coming by.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone, for listening.